The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned industrial district as Marcus adjusted his rifle scope for the third time. His hands moved with the practiced precision of someone who had done this countless times before. 3 years of perfect shots had earned him a reputation that spread far beyond his unit. His teammates often said he could thread a needle from half a mile away, and they were not exaggerating by much. Marcus lay flat on the concrete rooftop of an old factory building. The rough surface pressed against his body, but he barely noticed the discomfort. His focus was entirely on the warehouse 800 meters away. Through his scope, the building looked ordinary enough. Gray concrete walls weathered by years of neglect, broken windows that reflected the afternoon light like empty eyes, a loading dock that had not seen activity in months. Jake crouched beside him with a pair of military-grade binoculars. Jake had been spotting for Marcus for 2 years now. He knew how to read wind patterns and calculate distances better than most computers. His job was to feed Marcus the information needed for a perfect shot every time. Jake never missed a detail, and Marcus trusted him completely. Tommy sat a few feet away, hunched over a collection of radio equipment. Multiple frequencies crackled through his headset as he monitored enemy communications and stayed in contact with their command base. Tommy was the youngest member of their team, but his skills with technology made him invaluable. He could hack into enemy systems and intercept messages that often meant the difference between mission success and failure. The 3 men had worked together for so long they barely needed to speak. Each knew what the others were thinking. They moved like parts of the same machine. Marcus provided the deadly accuracy. Jake supplied the tactical intelligence. Tommy handled everything electronic. Together, they had completed 47 missions without a single failure. Today felt different, though Marcus could not explain why. Something in the air seemed to whisper that this mission would not be like the others. He pushed the feeling aside and focused on his equipment. The rifle was a custom-built piece that had never let him down. Every bolt and screw had been personally inspected. The scope was calibrated to perfection. The ammunition was hand-loaded for maximum accuracy. Their target was a man known only as the Broker. Intelligence reports described him as a weapons dealer who sold military-grade equipment to the highest bidder. He had been responsible for arming 3 different terrorist groups in the past 6 months. The weapons he provided had been used in attacks that killed dozens of innocent people. Taking him out would save many lives. The mission briefing had been straightforward. The Broker would arrive at the warehouse at exactly 3 in the afternoon. He always traveled alone to these meetings because he trusted no one. His paranoia about betrayal was legendary, but it also made him predictable. He would park his car in front of the main entrance and walk straight to the warehouse door. The entire operation would take less than 5 minutes from his arrival to his death. Marcus had studied the target photographs until he could recognize the Broker from any angle. The man was tall and thin with graying hair that he kept slicked back. He always wore expensive suits that looked out of place in the industrial settings where he conducted business. His face had the hard lines of someone who had seen too much violence and caused even more. The weather conditions were perfect for the shot. The wind was calm with only occasional light breezes that would not affect bullet trajectory. Visibility was crystal clear with no haze or atmospheric distortion. The distance of 800 meters was well within Marcus' range for a guaranteed kill shot. Everything pointed to what the team called an easy day at the office. Jake checked his watch and whispered that they had 30 minutes until target arrival. Marcus used the time to run through his mental checklist one more time. Rifle position was solid. Scope adjustments were locked in. Breathing pattern was controlled and steady. Heart rate was normal. Mind was focused and clear. He had done this routine so many times it had become automatic. Tommy reported that all communication channels were clear. No unusual radio traffic had been detected in the area. Enemy forces seemed unaware that their weapons supplier was about to be eliminated. Command confirmed that extraction routes remained open and secure. Everything was proceeding according to plan. The warehouse sat in the middle of a large empty lot surrounded by other abandoned buildings. There was nowhere for the target to take cover once he stepped out of his vehicle. The open ground provided Marcus with a clear field of fire from multiple angles. Even if the Broker somehow detected the threat, there would be no escape route available to him. Marcus thought about all the innocent people who would live because of what he was about to do. The families who would not lose fathers and mothers to terrorist attacks. The children who would grow up safe from the violence that the Broker helped spread across the world. These thoughts always made the difficult parts of his job easier to bear. Jake began providing regular updates on wind conditions and atmospheric readings. His voice was calm and professional as always. Tommy monitored radio frequencies for any sign that their position had been detected. The three men settled into the familiar rhythm of a sniper mission. Hours of patient waiting followed by a few seconds of deadly action. The sun moved slowly across the sky as the afternoon progressed. Shadows shifted and changed around the warehouse, but the target area remained clearly visible through Marcus' scope. He made minor adjustments to account for the changing light conditions, but maintained his sight picture on the main entrance, where the broker would appear. 258 showed on Jake watch when he spotted movement in the distance. A black sedan was approaching the warehouse along the main access road. The vehicle matched the description provided in their intelligence briefing. It moved at a steady speed, showing no signs that the driver suspected anything unusual about the quiet industrial district. Marcus felt his heart rate increase slightly, as it always did in the moments before a shot. The familiar sensation of heightened awareness washed over him. Every detail became sharp and clear. The texture of his rifle grip, the crosshairs in his scope, the sound of his own breathing. This was the moment he had trained for his entire career. The black sedan slowed as it approached the warehouse entrance. Marcus watched through his scope as the vehicle came to a complete stop, exactly where intelligence had predicted. The engine remained running for several seconds while the driver seemed to survey the area around him. This was typical behavior for the broker according to their briefing materials. The man was always cautious about potential threats, even though his paranoia had never saved him before. Jake pressed his binoculars against his eyes and began feeding Marcus the final calculations. Wind speed was holding steady at less than 2 miles per hour from the northwest. Temperature had risen 3 degrees since their arrival, but not enough to affect bullet trajectory significantly. Humidity levels remained constant throughout the afternoon. All environmental factors were well within acceptable ranges for a guaranteed kill shot. Tommy monitored his radio equipment with increased attention as the critical moment approached. His fingers moved across various dials and switches as he scanned multiple frequencies for any sign of trouble. Enemy communications remained silent. Local police channels showed no unusual activity. Military frequencies carried only routine traffic from units operating in distant sectors. The area around the warehouse was completely secure. The sedan door opened and a tall figure stepped out onto the concrete. Marcus immediately recognized the target from the photographs he had studied. The man wore a charcoal gray overcoat that hung loosely on his thin frame. His hair was perfectly styled despite the afternoon breeze. Even from 800 meters away, his expensive clothing was obvious. This was definitely the broker. Marcus centered his crosshairs on the target chest area. The man stood beside his vehicle for nearly 30 seconds, apparently checking something on his mobile phone. This gave Marcus plenty of time to ensure his aim was perfect. The target filled his scope exactly as he had visualized during mission planning. Range was confirmed at 823 meters. Wind compensation was minimal. Elevation adjustment was locked in place. The broker closed his phone and began walking toward the warehouse entrance. His stride was confident and unhurried. He showed no signs of concern about potential danger. His hands remained visible at all times with no indication he was carrying weapons. Everything about his behavior matched the intelligence profile they had received. He was completely unaware that death was tracking his every movement. Jake whispered final updates into his microphone. Target moving at normal walking speed toward primary kill zone. No changes in environmental conditions. Clear line of sight maintained throughout target approach. All systems ready for engagement. Marcus acknowledged each update with slight movements of his left hand, while keeping his right hand steady on the rifle grip. Marcus began his breathing routine exactly as he had been trained. Deep breath in through the nose. Hold for 3 seconds. Slow exhale through slightly parted lips. Another deep breath to fully oxygenate his blood. Hold again. Exhale slowly while beginning finger pressure on the trigger. His heart rate slowed as his body entered the focused state that made perfect shots possible. The target reached the halfway point between his car and the warehouse door. Marcus tracked him smoothly through the scope, keeping the crosshairs centered on his chest. The man movement was steady and predictable. No sudden direction changes or unexpected stops. He would reach the kill zone in approximately 15 seconds. Marcus began applying gradual pressure to the trigger. Tommy reported that all radio frequencies remained clear. No indication of backup units or security teams in the area. The broker appeared to be completely alone, as intelligence had predicted. Local authorities were occupied with routine matters in other parts of the city. Military units were engaged in training exercises far from this location. The timing could not have been better for their mission. The crosshairs settled perfectly on target center mass. Marcus could see individual details of the broker clothing through his high-powered scope. The texture of his overcoat fabric, the shine of his leather shoes, the slight movement of his tie in the afternoon breeze. Everything was crystal clear and perfectly steady. This would be one of the easiest shots of his career. Jake confirmed that wind conditions had not changed in the past 60 seconds. Temperature readings remained constant. Atmospheric pressure was stable. All ballistic calculations were locked in and verified. The bullet would travel 823 meters in exactly 1.2 seconds. Impact would occur just as the target reached the warehouse entrance. Clean kill shot with no possibility of survival. Marcus felt the familiar calm that always came in the final moments before firing. His breathing became automatic and controlled. His muscles relaxed except for those needed to maintain perfect rifle position. His mind cleared of all thoughts except the mechanics of making an accurate shot. Time seemed to slow as his finger continued applying pressure to the trigger. The broker was now less than 10 steps from the warehouse door. Marcus made a final microscopic adjustment to his aim point. The crosshairs were perfectly centered on the target chest, exactly where the heart would be located. At this range, with this ammunition, there would be no chance of survival even with immediate medical attention. The mission would be over in less than 5 seconds. Tommy gave a final all-clear report. No contacts approaching the target area, no changes in radio traffic patterns, no signs that enemy forces were aware of their presence. The warehouse district remained completely quiet except for the distant sound of traffic from the main highway. Everything was perfect for mission completion. Marcus took his final breath and held it as his finger completed its steady squeeze of the trigger. The rifle recoiled against his shoulder with familiar force. The sharp crack of the gunshot echoed across the empty industrial complex. Smoke drifted from the barrel as Marcus immediately began working the bolt to chamber another round. Through his scope, he expected to see the broker falling to the ground with a fatal chest wound. But something was very wrong. The target continued walking toward the warehouse entrance, showing no signs of injury. No blood, no stumbling. No indication that a high-powered rifle bullet had just struck him. Marcus blinked hard and refocused his scope, thinking perhaps the distance had caused an optical illusion. But the target was still moving normally and appeared completely unharmed. Jake lowered his binoculars with confusion written across his face. Tommy stopped monitoring his radio equipment to stare toward the warehouse. All 3 men watched in stunned silence as the broker reached the entrance and stopped to examine the door handle. The man who should have been dead was acting as if nothing had happened. Marcus stared through his scope in complete disbelief. The target should have been lying motionless on the concrete with a massive chest wound. Instead, the broker was calmly examining the warehouse door as if he was simply arriving for a normal business meeting. Marcus had never experienced anything like this in his 3 years of perfect shooting. Every calculation had been correct. Every environmental factor had been accounted for. The shot should have been impossible to miss. Jake grabbed his binoculars again and focused on the area around the warehouse entrance. He searched desperately for any sign that the bullet had struck something else. Perhaps it had hit the concrete wall behind the target. Maybe it had shattered one of the broken windows. But there was no visible damage anywhere near the broker position. No dust clouds from concrete impact. No glass fragments falling to the ground. No evidence that a high-powered rifle round had passed through the area at all. Tommy set down his radio headset and pulled out a small telescope to get his own view of the situation. His equipment showed that all communication channels remained completely quiet. No emergency calls about gunshots in the industrial district. No police dispatches to investigate unusual sounds. No military alerts about possible sniper activity. It was as if the rifle shot that all 3 men had clearly heard had never actually happened. The broker pulled out his mobile phone again and appeared to be checking the time. He looked relaxed and comfortable despite standing in what should have been a pool of his own blood. His expensive overcoat showed no tears or stains. His perfectly styled hair had not been disturbed by the impact of a bullet. Everything about his appearance and behavior suggested that Marcus' shot had somehow missed completely. Marcus began running through every possible explanation in his mind. Perhaps a sudden gust of wind had pushed the bullet off course at the last second. But Jake had reported no wind changes, and the flags on nearby buildings were hanging motionless in the still air. Maybe the rifle scope had been knocked out of alignment during their approach to the rooftop, but Marcus had checked the calibration multiple times and everything had been perfect. Jake started laughing first. It began as a quiet chuckle, but quickly grew louder as the impossibility of the situation sank in. The great Marcus, who had never missed a shot under combat conditions, had somehow failed to hit a stationary target at medium range under ideal weather conditions. Jake had seen Marcus put bullets through playing cards at twice this distance. He had watched him hit moving targets in heavy wind and rain. This miss made absolutely no sense. Tommy joined in the laughter as he realized what had happened. The legendary sniper who could supposedly thread a needle from half a mile away had whiffed on what should have been the easiest shot of his career. Tommy had been telling people for months that Marcus was more machine than man when it came to marksmanship. Now he would have to admit that even the best shooter in their unit was still human after all. Marcus felt his face burning with embarrassment as his teammates continued laughing. He had built his entire reputation on perfect accuracy and deadly precision. Other soldiers looked up to him as an example of what dedication and training could achieve. Officers recommended him for the most difficult assignments because they knew he would never let them down. Now that reputation was cracking apart because of one impossible miss, the laughter was infectious, and even Marcus found himself smiling despite his confusion and embarrassment. Perhaps Jake and Tommy were right to find humor in the situation. Everyone missed occasionally. Even professional athletes failed to perform perfectly every single time. Maybe this was just his turn to prove that he was human like everyone else. The important thing was to learn from the mistake and not let it happen again. Marcus worked the bolt of his rifle and chambered a fresh round. The metallic sound of the action cycling was sharp and clear in the afternoon air. He adjusted his position slightly to ensure maximum stability for the second shot. This time he would take even more care with his aim. He would double-check every calculation and verify every environmental factor. The broker was still standing near the warehouse entrance, providing an excellent target for redemption. Tommy wiped tears from his eyes as his laughter finally began to subside. He had never expected to see Marcus fail at anything related to shooting. The man practiced for hours every day and studied ballistics manuals like other people read novels. His dedication to perfection had always been inspiring. Seeing him miss such an easy shot was somehow both shocking and oddly reassuring. Even heroes had bad days sometimes. Jake pulled out his range-finding equipment to double-check the distance measurements. Perhaps there had been an error in his original calculations that had caused Marcus to aim incorrectly, but the laser rangefinder confirmed that the target was exactly 823 meters away, the same distance they had calculated during their initial setup. There had been no mistake in the basic measurements. The broker finished checking his phone and put it back in his coat pocket. He tried the warehouse door handle and found it unlocked. The heavy metal door swung open with a loud creaking sound that carried clearly across the empty lot. He paused for a moment at the threshold, apparently listening for sounds from inside the building. Then he stepped through the doorway and disappeared into the dark interior. Marcus quickly repositioned his rifle to track the target movement. Through his scope, he could see the broker silhouette moving around inside the warehouse. The man appeared to be examining stacks of wooden crates that were stored near the loading dock. His movements were calm and methodical, showing no awareness that someone had just tried to kill him from 800 meters away. The situation was becoming more complicated by the minute. Their intelligence had indicated that the broker would spend no more than 5 minutes at the warehouse before leaving for his next appointment. If Marcus was going to take a second shot, it would need to happen soon. But the target was now partially concealed by the warehouse walls, making a clean kill shot much more difficult to achieve. Jake suggested they abort the mission and return to base for debriefing. Missing one shot could be explained as equipment failure or human error. But attempting a second shot under less than ideal conditions risked exposing their position if something went wrong again. The smart tactical decision would be to withdraw and wait for another opportunity to eliminate the broker under better circumstances. Marcus refused to consider retreat. His pride as a sniper demanded that he complete the mission successfully. The broker was a dangerous enemy who needed to be eliminated before he could supply more weapons to terrorist organizations. Personal embarrassment was not sufficient reason to allow a high-value target to escape. He would take the second shot regardless of the increased difficulty. Tommy reported that the broker had moved deeper into the warehouse, where he was meeting with two other men who had apparently been waiting inside. The target was now completely hidden from their current shooting position. Any attempt to engage would require moving to a different location with an unknown tactical situation. The simple mission was rapidly becoming complicated and dangerous. Marcus watched through his scope as the broker emerged from the warehouse shadows and stepped back into the afternoon sunlight. The target had spent exactly 4 minutes inside the building talking with his contacts. Now he was walking back toward the main entrance where his black sedan waited with the engine still running. This was Marcus' chance for redemption. He would not miss a second time. The broker paused at the warehouse doorway and pulled out his mobile phone again. He stood perfectly still while reading what appeared to be a text message. His position was even better than before, because he was facing directly toward Marcus' shooting position. The target chest was clearly visible through the scope with no obstructions or interference. Range remained constant at 823 meters. Jake provided updated environmental readings even though nothing had changed since the first shot attempt. Wind speed was still less than 2 miles per hour. Temperature had risen only 1 degree. Humidity levels remained stable. Atmospheric pressure showed no variation from earlier measurements. Every factor that contributed to accurate long-range shooting was absolutely perfect for mission success. Marcus controlled his breathing and began applying steady pressure to the trigger. He had taken thousands of shots under similar conditions during training exercises. His muscle memory guided every movement from rifle positioning to sight alignment. The crosshairs settled on target center mass exactly where they belonged. This shot would restore his reputation and complete the mission successfully. Tommy monitored his radio equipment, but all frequencies remained quiet. No emergency services were responding to the area. No military units were conducting operations nearby. No police patrols were scheduled to pass through the industrial district. The isolation that made this location perfect for assassination attempts was working in their favor once again. The rifle recoiled against Marcus' shoulder as the second shot rang out across the empty landscape. The familiar crack echoed off the abandoned buildings before fading into silence. Marcus immediately worked the bolt to chamber a third round while maintaining his sight picture through the scope. He expected to see the broker collapse with a fatal chest wound this time, but the impossible happened again. The target remained standing at the warehouse entrance, completely unaffected by the high-powered bullet that should have killed him instantly. No blood appeared on his expensive overcoat. No impact was visible on his body. He continued reading his text message as if nothing had occurred. Marcus blinked hard and refocused his scope, thinking his eyes were playing tricks on him. Jake lowered his binoculars with his mouth hanging open in shock. He had been watching the target through high-magnification optics when the shot was fired. The bullet should have been clearly visible, striking the broker chest at that range. Instead, there had been no impact at all. No spray of blood. No violent backward motion from the kinetic energy transfer. Nothing that indicated a rifle round had even passed near the target. Tommy stopped monitoring his radio equipment and stared toward the warehouse in complete confusion. 2 perfect shots under ideal conditions had produced no results whatsoever. Either their ammunition was defective or something very strange was happening in the industrial district, but defective bullets would have struck the ground or buildings behind the target. There was no evidence of impact anywhere in the area. The broker finished reading his message and put the phone back in his coat pocket. He looked around the warehouse grounds one final time before beginning his walk back to the waiting sedan. His movements were casual and unhurried, showing no concern about potential threats. It was as if he existed in a different reality where bullets could not touch him. Marcus felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool afternoon air. 3 years of perfect marksmanship were being destroyed by an impossible situation that made no logical sense. He had hit targets at greater distances in worse weather conditions. The rifle was functioning normally. The ammunition was from the same batch that had performed flawlessly during recent training exercises. Every technical aspect of the shooting was correct. Then something even more disturbing began to happen. As Marcus watched through his scope, the broker started to become less solid and more transparent. It was a gradual change that happened slowly over several seconds. The man outline began to fade like morning mist disappearing in sunlight. His expensive clothing became see-through. His carefully styled hair took on a ghostly appearance. Jake rubbed his eyes thinking fatigue was causing hallucinations. But when he looked through his binoculars again, the target was still becoming more and more transparent. The concrete wall behind the broker was becoming visible through his fading body. The warehouse door could be seen clearly even though the target was standing directly in front of it. This was not a trick of light or atmospheric conditions. Tommy grabbed a small camera from his equipment pack and began recording what he was seeing. No one would believe their report without visual evidence of the impossible events taking place at the warehouse. Through the camera viewfinder, he could clearly see the broker continuing to fade away like a ghost in an old horror movie. The process was slow but steady and completely unexplainable. Marcus kept his rifle trained on the disappearing target but no longer had any confidence that bullets could affect whatever the broker actually was. The crosshairs in his scope were now aimed at empty air, where a solid human being had been standing moments before. The sedan remained parked with its engine running, but its passenger was vanishing into nothingness. Within 30 seconds, the broker had faded completely from view. The warehouse entrance stood empty, with only the afternoon shadows to mark where he had been. The concrete steps showed no footprints. The gravel parking area displayed no evidence that anyone had walked across it. It was as if the target had never existed at all except in their shared imagination. Jake lowered his binoculars and looked at his teammates with fear growing in his eyes. Professional soldiers were trained to handle dangerous situations and unexpected complications, but nothing in their experience had prepared them for watching a human being simply dissolve into thin air. The mission parameters had never mentioned anything about supernatural phenomena or unexplained disappearances. Tommy stopped recording and checked his camera to make sure it had captured the vanishing process. The digital display showed clear footage of the broker gradually becoming transparent before disappearing completely. This was proof that they had not suffered a group hallucination. Something genuinely impossible had occurred at the warehouse and they had witnessed every second of it. The black sedan continued idling in front of the empty warehouse. Steam rose from its exhaust pipe in the cooling air. The driver door remained closed and no one was visible in the passenger compartment. But the engine kept running as if its owner planned to return at any moment. The ordinary vehicle looked sinister now that its passenger had vanished in such an unnatural way. The silence that followed. The broker disappearance was unlike anything the three men had ever experienced. It was not the normal quiet of an empty industrial district. This was a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to press down on them from all directions. Even the distant sounds of traffic from the main highway had faded away completely. The world around them felt dead and lifeless. Jake was the first to break the terrifying quiet. His voice came out as a hoarse whisper that barely carried across the rooftop. He asked Marcus if he had seen what just happened. The question sounded foolish even as he spoke it. All three men had witnessed the same impossible event. But Jake needed confirmation that his mind had not finally snapped under the pressure of too many dangerous missions. Marcus slowly lifted his head from the rifle scope and looked at his teammates. His face was pale and covered with cold sweat despite the warm afternoon temperature. He had spent years training his mind to stay calm under extreme stress. Combat situations that would panic ordinary people barely raised his heart rate. But watching a human being fade into nothingness had shaken him to his core. Tommy rewound the footage on his camera and played it back for the others to see. The small screen clearly showed the broker standing at the warehouse entrance one moment and gradually becoming transparent the next. Within seconds, the target had vanished completely, leaving only empty space where he had been. The recording proved they had not imagined the supernatural disappearance. Jake grabbed his binoculars and began scanning the entire warehouse complex, searching for any sign of the broker. Perhaps the man had somehow moved to a different location while they were distracted. Maybe he was hiding behind one of the abandoned buildings waiting for the right moment to escape. But the industrial district remained completely empty in every direction. The black sedan continued running at the warehouse entrance like a faithful dog waiting for its master to return. White exhaust smoke drifted from the tailpipe and dissolved into the still air. The car radio was playing soft music that could barely be heard across the empty lot. Everything about the vehicle suggested its owner would be back within minutes. But they all knew that would never happen. Marcus tried to think of rational explanations for what they had witnessed. Perhaps the broker was using some kind of advanced camouflage technology, that made him invisible to optical devices. Military research programs were always developing new ways to hide soldiers on the battlefield. But even the most sophisticated camouflage could not make a person completely transparent like a ghost. Tommy suggested that someone might be playing an elaborate trick on them using holographic projection equipment. Hollywood special effects could create realistic images that appeared solid from a distance. Maybe their target had never been real at all, but was simply a three-dimensional illusion designed to confuse them. But his camera had recorded a physical person who cast shadows and interacted with the warehouse door. Jake wondered if they were suffering from some kind of chemical poisoning that was causing group hallucinations. Enemy forces sometimes used psychoactive drugs to disorient attacking troops. Perhaps their water supply had been contaminated with substances that affected perception and memory. But all three men had eaten and drunk from different sources throughout the day. Mass poisoning seemed unlikely. The radio equipment that Tommy had been monitoring suddenly crackled to life with static and interference. Random voices speaking in languages none of them recognized filled the airwaves. The sounds were distorted and difficult to understand, but they seemed urgent and frightened. Tommy adjusted his controls trying to isolate the signals, but they faded back into static within seconds. Marcus picked up his rifle again and scanned the warehouse area through the high-powered scope. Every detail was crystal clear, from the broken windows to the weeds growing through cracks in the concrete. But there was no sign of human presence anywhere within his field of view. The broker had not simply moved to a new location. He had genuinely vanished from existence. A cold wind suddenly began blowing across the rooftop, even though the flags on nearby buildings continued hanging motionless. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees within moments. Jake pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders and noticed that his breath was becoming visible in small puffs of vapor. The pleasant afternoon weather was changing into something much more unnatural. Tommy tried contacting their command base using the encrypted radio system, but received only static in response. All military frequencies that had been clear and functional throughout the day were now filled with electronic noise. Emergency services channels were similarly affected. It was as if some kind of interference was blocking all radio communications in the area. The warehouse itself began to look different through Marcus' scope. Shadows that had been sharp and well-defined were now blurry and shifting. Windows that had been clearly broken were sometimes intact and sometimes shattered depending on the angle of view. The building seemed to be flickering between different states of reality like a television with poor reception. Jake started backing away from the edge of the rooftop without consciously deciding to move. Every instinct developed through years of combat experience was telling him to leave this place immediately. The industrial district had become dangerous in ways that weapons and training could not protect against. They were dealing with forces that existed outside normal understanding. Tommy packed his radio equipment with hands that shook slightly from nervousness. The mission briefing had not prepared them for supernatural encounters. Their training covered combat tactics and survival skills, but nothing about disappearing targets and reality distortions. They were completely out of their depth in this situation. Marcus finally admitted what all three men were thinking. This was not a normal military operation. The broker was not a regular human being. The warehouse was not simply an abandoned building. Everything about this mission felt wrong from the very beginning. They should have trusted their instincts and called for extraction when the first impossible thing started happening. The black sedan engine suddenly stopped running even though no one had approached the vehicle. The sudden silence was more frightening than any explosion would have been. The car sat motionless in front of the empty warehouse like a tomb marker in a graveyard. Whatever had happened to the broker was now affecting his vehicle as well. Jake suggested they leave the area immediately and report their findings to command personnel who were trained to handle unusual situations. Staying longer would serve no useful purpose and might put them in additional danger. The mission was clearly a failure, but at least they were still alive to tell about their strange experience. Marcus agreed that retreat was their only sensible option. He began packing his rifle while keeping one eye on the warehouse complex. The building continued flickering between different appearances, as if it could not decide which version of reality it belonged to. Nothing about this place felt safe or normal anymore. Tommy frantically worked his radio controls trying to establish contact with their command base. The static had grown worse over the past few minutes, making communication nearly impossible. He adjusted frequencies and boosted signal strength, but could only receive fragments of distorted voices speaking in unknown languages. The electronic interference seemed to be getting stronger as time passed. Finally, a brief clear channel opened and Tommy managed to connect with the operations center. He quickly identified himself using proper military codes and requested immediate extraction from their current position. The voice on the other end acknowledged his transmission and asked for their mission status report. Tommy explained they had encountered unexpected complications and needed to abort the operation. The response from command made Tommy blood run cold. The operations officer stated clearly that no sniper team had been deployed to the industrial district that day. According to official records, Tommy, Jake, and Marcus were all listed as being on leave for the next 48 hours. No mission had been authorized for their unit. No targets were scheduled for elimination in that sector of the city. Tommy asked the operator to double-check the mission files using the broker code name and warehouse location coordinates. Several minutes passed while military computers searched through classified databases. The operations center reported back that no individual matching that description appeared in any current target lists. No weapons dealer by that name was known to military intelligence services. Marcus and Jake listened in stunned silence as Tommy relayed the information from command headquarters. Their mission briefing documents had seemed completely authentic with proper signatures and classification markings. The target photographs had looked genuine. Intelligence reports about the broker activities had contained specific details that would be difficult to fabricate convincingly. Jake pulled out the manila folder containing their original mission orders and examined every page carefully. The letterhead appeared correct with official military logos and department names. Security clearance levels were properly marked. Authorization codes followed standard formats used by their command structure. But now that he looked more closely, something felt wrong about the overall presentation. The paper quality seemed different from normal military documents. The ink had an unusual sheen that reflected light strangely. Some of the text appeared to have been printed using different fonts, even though it should have come from the same source. Most disturbing of all was the photograph of the broker, which now looked fuzzy and indistinct compared to how clear it had seemed. Earlier, Tommy continued his radio conversation with the operations center, asking about possible classified missions that might not appear in standard databases. Sometimes special forces conducted operations that were kept secret, even from other military units. Perhaps their assignment had come from a higher level of command that did not share information with regular personnel. The operations officer became more concerned as the conversation continued. He stated that all three men were supposed to be enjoying recreational leave after completing a difficult assignment the previous week. Their commanding officer had specifically ordered them to rest and recover before returning to active duty. No one should have given them new mission orders during their mandatory break period. Marcus felt a growing sense of dread as the implications became clear. Someone had deliberately sent them to this location with false mission orders and fabricated target information. But who had the authority and resources to create such convincing forgeries? More importantly, what was the real purpose behind bringing them to the abandoned warehouse district? Jake noticed that his hands were shaking as he continued examining the mission documents. The photographs of the broker were becoming increasingly blurry, as if the images were somehow fading away. Text that had been clearly readable was now smeared and difficult to understand. The official signatures looked less authentic with each passing minute. Tommy reported to his teammates that command was sending a security team to investigate their situation. Military police would arrive within 30 minutes to collect them and determine how they had received unauthorized mission orders. The incident would trigger a full investigation into possible security breaches and enemy infiltration of their communication systems. The warehouse complex below them began to look different in the late afternoon light. Buildings that had appeared solid and permanent now seemed less substantial. Shadows moved in ways that did not match the position of the sun. Windows reflected images that did not correspond to their actual surroundings. The entire industrial district felt like it was becoming less real. Marcus realized they needed to leave immediately before the situation became even more dangerous. Whatever force had brought them to this place was still active and growing stronger. The false mission orders were just the beginning of something much larger and more threatening. They were being manipulated by someone or something with abilities that went far beyond normal human capabilities. Jake stood up from examining the documents and announced that they were completely fake. The paper was dissolving in his hands, leaving behind only blank sheets. The photographs had vanished entirely. Even the official seals and signatures had disappeared as if they had never existed. They had been carrying empty folders without realizing it. Tommy packed his radio equipment quickly while maintaining contact with the operations center. He informed command that they would be moving to the primary extraction point immediately. The security team would meet them there for debriefing and investigation. He did not mention the supernatural events they had witnessed, knowing that no one would believe such an incredible story. Marcus disassembled his rifle with practiced efficiency, despite his growing anxiety. The weapon that had failed to affect the broker now felt different in his hands. The metal surfaces were colder than they should have been. The scope showed strange reflections that did not match their surroundings. Even his most trusted equipment seemed to be influenced by whatever force controlled this place. The black sedan at the warehouse entrance suddenly burst into flames, even though no one had approached it. The fire spread quickly, consuming the entire vehicle within seconds. There was no explosion or sound of burning fuel. The car simply disappeared in bright flames that left no smoke or debris behind. Within moments, nothing remained where the sedan had been parked. Jake pointed toward the horizon and noticed that storm clouds were gathering rapidly in the previously clear sky. Lightning flickered between the dark clouds but made no sound. The wind was picking up speed and changing direction constantly. Weather patterns that should take hours to develop were happening in minutes. Nature itself seemed to be responding to their presence. Tommy received final confirmation from command that extraction teams were en route to their location. The operations center had classified their situation as a potential security emergency, requiring immediate investigation. Senior officers were being briefed about the unauthorized mission orders and possible enemy involvement in creating false documentation. Marcus took one last look through his rifle scope at the warehouse complex. The buildings were flickering more rapidly now, switching between different versions of reality. Sometimes the structures appeared new and well-maintained. Other times they looked ancient and crumbling. Occasionally they seemed to be on fire or covered with strange symbols that hurt his eyes to look at directly. The three men began packing their equipment with urgent speed as the supernatural disturbances around them grew stronger. Marcus secured his rifle in its protective case while Jake folded up his spotting scope and range-finding gear. Tommy gathered his radio equipment and made sure all sensitive items were properly contained. They needed to reach the extraction point before whatever controlled this place decided to prevent their escape. As Marcus sealed his equipment bag, he noticed something that made his heart stop beating. One of the mission photographs had not completely faded away like the others. A single image remained visible, showing the broker standing in front of what appeared to be a different building entirely. But in the background, barely noticeable unless someone looked very carefully, was a small granite headstone. Marcus called his teammates over to examine the photograph more closely. The headstone was partially hidden behind the broker figure, but enough was visible to read most of the inscription. The name carved into the stone matched their target exactly. Below the name was a date that made all three men feel sick to their stomachs. The death date was 15 years in the past. Jake grabbed the photograph and held it closer to his eyes, thinking the fading light was making him misread the carved numbers. But there was no mistake about what the headstone showed. Their target had died in a car accident 15 years ago, according to the date on his grave marker. The man they had been sent to assassinate had been buried long before any of them had even joined the military. Tommy tried to find a rational explanation for what they were seeing. Perhaps the broker was not the real name of their target. Maybe someone else had taken over the dead man identity and was using it to conduct illegal weapons deals. But the photograph clearly showed the same face they had been studying all day. The same gray hair and expensive clothing. The same confident posture and cold eyes. Marcus realized they had been hunting a ghost from the very beginning. The man who had stepped out of the black sedan and walked to the warehouse entrance had been dead for over a decade. No wonder their bullets had passed through him without causing any damage. You cannot kill someone who is already in the grave. Their most advanced weapons were useless against supernatural targets. The warehouse complex below them began to change more dramatically as the truth became clear. Buildings that had looked abandoned and empty were now showing signs of activity from years past. Lights flickered in windows that had been broken moments before. Vehicles that belonged to different time periods appeared and disappeared in the parking areas. The entire district was replaying memories from its own history. Jake noticed that the photograph was continuing to fade, but now he could see more details about the background location. The headstone was located in Riverside Cemetery on the north side of the city. Section 12, plot number 47 according to the small numbers visible on the granite base. Someone or something had wanted them to discover this information once their mission was completed. Tommy suggested they visit the cemetery to verify what the photograph was showing them. If the broker was really buried there, it would prove they had encountered something beyond normal human understanding. But visiting a graveyard after experiencing supernatural phenomena seemed like an extremely dangerous idea. Some knowledge was too frightening to pursue. Marcus looked through his rifle scope one final time at the warehouse where the broker had vanished. The building was now completely different from what they had been observing all afternoon. Instead of gray concrete walls, he could see wooden structures that belonged to an earlier era. Horse-drawn wagons were moving around the loading dock area. People in old-fashioned clothing were conducting business that had ended decades ago. The storm clouds overhead were growing darker and more threatening. Lightning continued flashing between the black masses but still made no sound. The wind was becoming stronger and carried strange odors that reminded Marcus of old graveyards and funeral homes. The very air around them felt heavy with the presence of things that should not exist in the living world. Jake started walking toward the stairway that led down from the rooftop. He had seen enough supernatural events for one day, and wanted to reach the extraction point before their situation became even worse. Professional soldiers were trained to handle combat stress and dangerous missions, but nothing in their experience had prepared them for encounters with the dead. Tommy followed Jake toward the stairs while continuing to monitor his radio for updates from the extraction team. Command reported that security personnel were already en route and would arrive at the pickup location within 15 minutes. Military investigators were standing by to debrief them about the false mission orders and determine who was responsible for the security breach. Marcus took one last photograph of the warehouse complex using Tommy camera equipment. He wanted proof of what they had witnessed, even though he knew no one would believe their story. The camera display showed the buildings flickering between different time periods exactly as he was seeing with his own eyes. At least they would have some evidence of the impossible events. As the three men descended the stairway leading down from the rooftop, Marcus made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He would never speak about what they had experienced at the warehouse. Some secrets were too dangerous to share with other people. Some knowledge could drive ordinary minds to madness if they tried to understand it fully. Jake agreed that their encounter with the broker should remain classified at the highest levels. Military personnel who learned about supernatural threats might lose confidence in their equipment and training. Soldiers needed to believe that bullets could solve problems, and enemies could be defeated through superior tactics and firepower. Doubt about such fundamental concepts could be fatal in combat situations. Tommy decided to delete the video footage he had recorded of the broker vanishing into thin air. No good could come from showing such impossible images to people who were not prepared to accept them. The camera memory was wiped clean, leaving no trace of the supernatural disappearance they had witnessed. Some truths were too frightening to preserve. The industrial district grew quiet behind them as they walked toward their extraction point. The warehouse returned to its normal abandoned appearance. The storm clouds began to disperse, revealing the late afternoon sky. Even the unnatural wind died down to normal levels. It was as if their presence had been the catalyst for all the supernatural activity they had experienced. Marcus, Jake, and Tommy never discussed their mission to eliminate the broker after that day. Each man carried the memory of impossible events that challenged everything they thought they knew about reality. They continued their military careers, but none of them ever felt quite the same about the world around them. Some experiences changed people forever, and this was one of them. Years later, Marcus would sometimes dream about the man in the expensive overcoat who had faded away like morning mist. In those dreams, the broker would turn and smile at him with knowledge of secrets that living people were never meant to understand. Marcus would wake up in cold sweats wondering if their encounter had been real, or just an elaborate shared hallucination brought on by stress and fatigue. But deep down he knew the truth. They had been chosen for reasons they would never comprehend to witness something that existed beyond the normal boundaries of life and death. The dead sometimes returned to finish business they had left incomplete in life, and sometimes the living were called upon to play roles in stories that had begun long before they were born.